In June 1876, the telephone's future rested on a sweltering afternoon at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition. A Smithsonian piece from late last month describes how Alexander Graham Bell needed the eyes of international dignitaries and government sponsors just to prove his invention wasn't a toy. It's a reminder of an era when a new technology had to win over the public square to survive. A different pattern emerges when this history sits alongside a June essay by Zachary Groz for the American Prospect. Groz tracks how modern tech firms use public pension funds and state contracts to shield themselves from market risk. It's worth pausing on this shift from seeking public visibility to using public capital to bypass accountability. Writing in late June, the writer revisits the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition to show how Alexander Graham Bell's telephone nearly missed its debut. It's easy to forget that Bell had to be talked into leaving Boston for a fair where visitors could climb the unfinished hand of the Statue of Liberty. Notice the way the piece describes Bell's impatience with the judges, a tension that makes clear how much he relied on this international stage to validate his invention.
Everyone wanted Alexander Graham Bell to debut the telephone at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition. He almost avoided it entirely. The inventor had to be persuaded to make the trip from Boston, then balked at the thought of a delay in debuting his device. But history interceded, and his American innovation got its proper accolades. 1876 was already an eventful year. In March, Melville Dewey acquired copyright for his eponymous decimal system for organizing books. In April, the Boston Red Caps defeated the Philadelphia Athletics in the first National League baseball game team. In early June, Mark Twain published The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. That same month, two more momentous events occurred in American history. The young Republican Party nominated Rutherford B. Hayes for president in Cincinnati, and on the other side of the country, joint forces of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment near Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. But for inventor Alexander Graham Bell, the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition overshadowed everything else that happened. The opening ceremonies in May were a major celebration. Bells rang out across the city, and German composer Richard Wagner debuted an original commission for the occasion. It wasn't well received. President Ulysses S. Grant opened the exhibition. Only 100 years ago, our country was new, he intoned. But the exhibition would show what Americans had already achieved in law, medicine, and theology, in science, literature, philosophy, and the fine arts. In Fairmount Park along the Schuylkill River, the exhibition sprawled across more than 200 structures. The main building was reportedly the world's largest edifice, with an area of more than 20 acres.
The exhibition was filled with wonders. More than 20,000 exhibits featuring everything from household items to revolutionary electric devices. Over 185,000 people attended that first day, and nearly 10 million attended by the time it closed in November. Visitors could scale the torch-holding hand of the unfinished Statue of Liberty. They could taste Heinz ketchup for the first time. They could see John Roebling's wire rope, which would soon be suspended between the Brooklyn Bridge's two colossal towers then under construction. The exhibition was the work of the people of the United States, James Dabney McCabe asserted in his illustrated history of that year, conceived by them, carried forward to its close by them, and made by them the grandest success of the century. Did you know? Inequality at the exhibition. Though many wished to see the exhibition as confirmation that the divisions of the Civil War were over, Black Americans were generally omitted from participation in all but the most menial roles, and Frederick Douglass was nearly denied entry by the police to sit with President Grant on the dais for the exhibition opening. At the last minute, women had been relegated to funding for themselves a separate women's pavilion, which displayed Black sculptor Edmonia Lewis's The Death of Cleopatra. Many of the Native American displays caricatured and stereotyped indigenous life. In the machinery hall, Grant started the 1,400-horsepower Corliss steam engine, the largest of its kind ever built, at nearly 70 feet tall, 650 tons, which generated enough energy to power the inventions on display. The New York Herald claimed that, quote, strong men were moved to tears of joy when it chugged into motion, and the crowd's cheers were followed by, quote, the tinkling of 1,000 bells and the clinking and thudding and hammering of 13 acres of vast machinery. Bell, meanwhile, was debuting a wonder of his own, the telephone. Urged by his fiancée, Mabel Hubbard, and her father, Gardner, Bell had finally paused his school examination work in Boston to demonstrate the new device in hopes of securing national and international recognition. For generations, the men in Bell's family had devoted their lives to elocution. George Bernard Shaw probably based Pygmalion's Henry Higgins in part on the Bells. The family had been shoemakers in St. Andrews, Scotland, until the first Alexander Bell, Bell's grandfather, became a comic stage actor and moved to Edinburgh to perform. When his acting career waned and his children were born, including Bell's father, Alexander Melville Bell, he returned to St. Andrews and became a speech instructor, specializing in stammering. Melville acquired these skills too, and when he was sent to Newfoundland to recover from illness, his first of several trips to Canada, he taught Shakespeare and corrected stammers alongside his clerking job. Upon fully recovering, Melville rejoined his father in Britain and returned to Edinburgh, where he married Eliza Grace Simmons in 1844. On March 3, 1847, Alexander Graham Bell was born, the middle of 3 sons. Though money was often tight, Melville earned enough from lecturing and teaching to purchase a home in Edinburgh to raise their family. But the Bell brothers were also plagued by ill health, exacerbated by the smog of British cities.
After 2 of Melville's sons died of tuberculosis, he moved the family, his wife, widowed daughter-in-law, and remaining adult son, Alexander, to the town of Brantford, Ontario, for fresher air in 1870. He purchased a farm, which would become the Bell homestead. Alexander Graham Bell would quickly become friends with the local Mohawk chief, George Johnson, who allowed Bell to record his indigenous language in visible speech, a system of phonetic symbols developed by Melville that people who were deaf or hard of hearing could use to communicate orally. For much of his youth, Bell was fascinated by science in addition to elocution. After settling in Canada, he frequently spent hours long into the night tinkering with electrical devices. Throughout his life, Bell was motivated by his father's approval, but also frustrated by his domineering character. Melville had drilled Bell in visible speech and insisted that spreading its adoption should be his son's priority. As a result of his father's drive and his mother's deafness, Bell decided to dedicate himself to improving the lives of the deaf community, at least as he saw it. When Bell had recovered from a bout of tuberculosis and became eager to work again, Melville helped him arrange various teaching posts at schools for deaf communities in Massachusetts. One such school was the Clark Institution for Deaf Mutes in Northampton, whose president was Gardner Hubbard, a patent lawyer who was politically and financially well connected. In 1872, in his mid-20s, Bell opened his own school in Boston. A young Helen Keller would study with him, and Hubbard was impressed by Bell's pedagogy, so he put his daughter Mabel, stricken deaf by scarlet fever, under Bell's tutelage.
Hubbard, and the father of another student, soon became Bell's principal financial backers, and Bell and Mabel ultimately became engaged. In the summer of 1874, Bell took a break from teaching and returned to the homestead, ruminating on ways to improve deaf education. For perhaps his oddest experiment, he had acquired from a doctor some human ear tissues that he connected to a phonoautograph, a device that traced sound vibrations like a seismograph, to visualize the mechanics of listening. During this time, he knew that many inventors were racing to devise a multiple telegraph that could transmit several signals simultaneously. Bell confronted this challenge too, but because his strong suit was acoustics and not electricity, he approached the problem through sound. He aimed at a harmonic telegraph, which could use different frequencies to transmit simultaneous signals. He had a conceptual breakthrough. Using a vibrating membrane like the one in his ear phonoautograph, he could generate an undulating electric transmission. In contrast to the open-closed stop-start currents of traditional telegraphy, this continuous wave-like impulse could reproduce the human voice's modulating sounds. As historian Charlotte Gray explained in her Bell biography, Reluctant Genius, this extraordinary leap of the imagination is what put Bell ahead of the pack of inventors scrambling to advance the technology of communication. No one else knew enough about the human ear. The principles of modern telephony were born.
The advantages telephony had over telegraphy would be numerous, but one of the biggest was privacy, says Harold Wallace, curator of the electricity collections at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History.
Telegraph communication was a mediated experience, he explains. You had to have someone who knew Morse code transmit for you, and as you're sending a telegram, you've got to dictate or write that telegram for a telegrapher. By necessity, then, telegraphers eavesdropped on conversations. Telephony circumvented this. Because telephony held such great promise, Bell was by no means the first to propose transmitting the voice. From the 1840s through the 1870s, many others had imagined and built semi-successful, though unmarketable, apparatus. And Bell consulted many scientists about his ideas, including the first Smithsonian Institution secretary, Joseph Henry, who urged him to acquire a better understanding of electricity. Bell's attitude was that if Morse conquered his electrical difficulties, although he was only a painter, he could do the same despite being an elocutionist. He soon enlisted the dexterous Boston machinist Thomas Watson to help construct components, and by early 1875, the two were working side by side. While Bell and Watson toiled, electrical engineer Elisha Gray in Illinois conceived of a liquid transmitter that could theoretically also achieve voice transmission. Bell soon began to think along similar lines. Finally, on Valentine's Day in 1876, within hours of each other, Bell's lawyer filed a patent, and Gray's lawyer filed a caveat, a notice of intent to file a patent application later, designed to prevent someone else from patenting the same invention in the meantime. It's been speculated that Bell's lawyer learned of Gray's caveat and rushed his own application to the patent office to beat him. The matter remains hotly contested. In the years of litigation that followed, however, Bell's patent was continually upheld.
By some accounts, it became the most lucrative patent in history. But on that sweltering June day in Philadelphia, the matter was far from decided. As the first World's Fair held in the U.S., the Centennial Exhibition would put Bell and his telephone on the map. Bell had been reluctant to enter any sort of competition at the fair, however, deeming his instruments still experimental. When Hubbard attended the exhibition and saw the displays of Gray, Thomas Edison, and others, however, he telegraphed Bell in Boston to insist that he come. A committee led by Henry would judge telegraphic equipment on June 25th, and Bell couldn't afford to miss it. Exhibiting the telephone was critical to securing the invention as his. As a prominent Bostonian involved with the exhibition, Hubbard could secure him a last-minute spot. But Bell contended he was swamped with school exams and couldn't spare time for Philadelphia. Mabel, now his fiancée, interceded. Because her father was Bell's benefactor, and because Bell was perpetually in dire financial straits, their wedding hung in the balance. She prodded him to the train station, and at last he relented. The day of the demonstrations was scorching. The hall's multi-paned glass walls made the temperature inside even hotter. When Gray's turn came, he explained the transmission of musical tones at some length, which impressed the audience. But he was unable to give a convincing demonstration of telephony. Bell detected that Gray had failed to strengthen the undulatory current. At last, it was Bell's turn. But by now, the perspiring judges were exhausted. "Come back tomorrow," they said. Bell was obviously disappointed.
As he recalled 35 years later in a speech, that meant that the telephone would not be seen, for I was not going to come back another day. I was going right back to Boston. He had rushed to Philadelphia for nothing. But Bell was friends with an emperor. After participating in the exhibition's opening festivities, Brazil's Pedro II had visited Boston at Bell's invitation. On June 14, Dom Pedro observed Bell's classes and, impressed with the system, requested copies of his father's book on visible speech. Less than 2 weeks later in Philadelphia, already familiar with Bell's ingenuity, Don Pedro would come see his new acquaintance's telephone, even if the judges wouldn't. As Bell recalled in his 1911 speech, he took my arm and walked off with me, and of course where an emperor led the way, the other judges followed, and the telephone exhibit was saved. Bell displayed several objects, including an iron box receiver, liquid transmitter, double-pole magnetotelephone, and single-pole magnetotelephone. In a demonstration of his invention, Bell hastened to the gallery's far end to transmit, while Sir William Thomson, the renowned Scottish electricity expert who helped design the first transatlantic telegraph cable, took up the receiver. Thomson later became Baron Kelvin, for whom units of absolute temperature are named. As a fellow Scotsman, Bell particularly wanted to impress Thomson. When Bell sang into the telephone, Thomson couldn't believe his ears. Don Pedro was eager to try. From the receiver, he heard Bell utter the ghostly words of Hamlet's famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be, that is the question." The Emperor was shocked. "My God," he cried, "it speaks." The astounded audience became frenzied, jostling for a chance to use the telephone.
Even Gray stepped up to listen. "Aye, there's the rub," he repeated to the cheering crowd what he'd heard over the wires. Bell's presentation was an unqualified success. He had actually demonstrated an instrument whose functions Gray and others had struggled to produce. Henry effused that the telephone was the greatest marvel hitherto achieved by the telegraph, and Bell was awarded a gold medal for electrical equipment, as well as for his display on visible speech. In the coming weeks and months, he continued his telephone experiments, gradually expanding the distance of subsequent calls and transmitting Yankee Doodle, Robert Burns poetry, Macbeth, Hamlet, a Mohawk greeting from Chief George Johnson, and other memorable messages. According to Robert Stanchik, the curator of the Bell homestead in Canada, Johnson may be the first Indigenous person to ever speak over the telephone. In July, calls were attempted from Boston to New York and other places. More successful calls were made from Brantford to Mount Pleasant, 5 miles away, using the Centennial Exhibition receiver. In October, the first two-way call took place between Boston and Cambridge. Throughout 1877, commercial telephone adoption exploded in New England. Mark Twain became one of its earliest adopters, publishing his comical sketch A Telephonic Conversation in 1880. Listening to a telephone conversation is one of the solemnest curiosities of modern life, Twain wrote, but I notice that one can always write best when somebody is talking through a telephone close by. Why did Bell choose poetry or Shakespeare for his telephony experiments? As elocutionists, the Bells knew poetry by heart, because having quotations handy was helpful for demonstrating proper pronunciation. Similarly, Shakespeare was universally regarded as worth knowing. Well-known verses, not just Shakespeare, but songs and nursery rhymes, were used to test and help new technologies succeed. Early transmissions were coarse, but listeners such as Dom Pedro could recognize poetry's rhythms, rhymes, and assonances, even if words themselves were unclear. For these reasons, Bell would also recite Auld Lang Syne and other well-known songs during his many telephone demonstrations. As telephony spread, commentators imagined systems for delivering plays, concerts, sermons, and lectures, much like radio, in addition to business and personal conversations. And their recitations of Shakespeare weren't limited to telephony. In the 1880s, Bell founded Volta Laboratory in Washington, D.C., where he and his associates developed the graphophone to compete with Edison's phonograph. In 2013, the Smithsonian, with help from scientists at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, LBL, recovered an 1881 recording in which Melville Bell proclaimed, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in our philosophy." Again, from Hamlet. Carlene Stevens, curator of mechanisms, led the recovery team and was struck by Melville's gravitas. While Bell worried that he would be a one-hit wonder and perhaps sounded more cautious, she explains, Melville's belting of Shakespeare had more of a presence, apropos of an experienced elocutionist. With colleagues at LBL and the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian also recovered a recording of Bell reciting numbers, the only surviving evidence of his voice at the time. When Stevens' team put it online, the widespread interest shocked her. The public was drawn to Bell's voice because, in living memory, nobody knew what he sounded like.
And there's a huge irony, of course, that the man who brought us the telephone wasn't a common voice in our ears.
What sticks after looking at Bell's debut in Philadelphia is the sheer necessity of the crowd. The writer describes a moment where innovation required a physical, government-sanctioned stage, 20 acres of buildings, and 10 million visitors to transform a private invention into a public fact. For Bell, legitimacy was something earned through visibility and the proper accolades of a collective audience. Turn the page to Zachary Groz, And that relationship between technology and the public looks inverted. Where Bell sought the exhibition to prove his device's worth, Groz argues that modern giants like SpaceX use public resources, pension funds, tax credits, and federal contracts to insulate themselves from the very market accountability Bell was chasing. The interesting thing is the shift in what public actually means. In 1876, the public was the judge in the gallery. In Groz's account, the public has become a silent, often involuntary backstop. Read alongside the Smithsonian piece, the SpaceX IPO isn't just a financial maneuver. It's a strategy to bypass the kind of scrutiny that once happened on the exhibition floor. These two perspectives suggest that while tech once needed the public to believe in it, it now mostly needs the public to underwrite it.
As startups, they were financed by federal grants and bailed out with federal loans. As fledgling private companies, they soaked up state and local tax credits and cash subsidies to become dominant market actors. After capturing huge swaths of the market, pumping money into elections, and lobbying concessions out of lawmakers and agencies, they reinvented themselves as the federal government's contractors of choice. Now, as the Prospect has been reporting the past month, Elon Musk's $2 trillion bundle of tech companies has been backstopped again by the taxpayer, this time on the shoulders of millions of passive investors and pensioners with no choice other than to own a piece of SpaceX. The company's initial public offering, which is now the biggest in history, has managed to spook almost everyone orbiting around it. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, has warned it may threaten the integrity and stability of our capital markets and cements the most rigged corporate structure in history. The Council of Institutional Institutions, CII, a trade group representing dozens of retirement funds, endowments, and money managers, seems to agree with that assessment. The group has balked at SpaceX's two-class shareholder voting structure, which leaves Musk in complete control of corporate board appointments, and at the offering's fairly overt suggestion that the board expects huge conflicts of interest to arise in the future, which it doesn't intend to police. CII also has highlighted a provision requiring shareholders to take practically all disputes to a single newly created specialty court in Texas, where Musk can expect a huge home field advantage. Texas Governor
Greg Abbott, a Republican, a key Musk ally, handpicks its judges, who, subject to approval by the state legislature, serve 2-year terms and can be reappointed in perpetuity. Taken together, the structure of the offering may pave the way soon enough for a merger of SpaceX and Tesla, which at least one Musk acolyte is saying could birth the first $100 trillion company. Combined today, the new entity's market cap would miss that mark by about $96 trillion, though it would still approach NVIDIA, Apple, and Google parent Alphabet as the highest valued company in the world. SpaceX's $2 trillion blockbuster offering won't be the last of the fast-tracked mega IPOs propped up by institutional investors. The tech-heavy NASDAQ stock exchange, which, besides its newly formed Texas offshoot, is the only exchange where SpaceX is listed, bent its own rules out of shape to allow any company valued at $200 billion or higher to join in a matter of weeks instead of months, and to artificially inflate the volume of its publicly traded stocks, boosting its footprint in index funds. The day after those rule changes passed, SpaceX submitted its first paperwork to the Securities and Exchange Commission to go public. Bay Area behemoths OpenAI and Anthropic, both eyeing IPOs later this year, may be next to join the NASDAQ at greater than $1 trillion valuations, drawing on index funds as captive shareholders yet again. The NASDAQ rule changes may usher in a brave new world for passive investors and pensioners, who, tied up in index funds, once thought to be the most responsible way to play the market, now find themselves exposed to a huge amount of risk at the center of the economy.
In the grander scheme, the bet may never have been so safe, argues Australian National University sociologist Melinda Cooper in a new paper. Cooper, who's best known for her work on the history of capitalism in the second half of the 20th century, traces the story back to the late 1970s and early 80s, when Congress passed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, and amended a New Deal-era securities law to allow capital to flow from institutional investors to private money managers. Public pension funds soon forged alliances with private investment firms and began collaborating on leveraged buyouts. For players in the field, it became basically impossible, Cooper writes, not to, quote, acknowledge the arrival of institutional investors as a game changer. To illustrate the point, she looks at private equity firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR, which now holds over $750 billion in assets, but was just a boutique back in the 1970s. In 1978, KKR had raised less than $50 million in capital, which it used to complete an infamous $380 million debt-financed buyout of auto parts manufacturer Hudile Industries, eventually leading to that company's implosion. KKR made a killing off the deal, though, recording a 33% annual return until the recession of the early 80s led the group to scrap and sell the industrial parts seller for parts. After that, it was off to the races, and pension funds provided enormous amounts of capital to scale the business model, which went something like this. Use the raised capital as collateral for loans, leverage the loans to buy companies, take them private, load them up with more debt, and strip them down for quick and dirty profits. In 1982, partnering with state pension funds in Michigan, Oregon, and Washington, KKR was able to raise over $350 million in capital, which produced close to a 40% return. Private investment firms like hedge funds really took off after the National Securities Markets Improvement Act of 1996, signed by Bill Clinton, which removed the limit on how many clients hedge funds could take money from, and made institutional investors with over $25 million in assets, like pension funds, qualified purchasers. After the law passed, hedge fund assets increased tenfold to $1.2 trillion within 7 years. Pension funds and private investment firms developed a kind of symbiosis with one another. But according to Cooper, it's always been a conflicted symbiosis. Although they need each other to achieve their aims at scale, their business models and economic objectives remain distinct. Since the New Deal, federal law has imposed different regulatory regimes on private money managers, who answer to a self-selected group of investors and partners, and institutional investors, who represent millions of public workers and small savers. That distinction over time has created a partisan divide between venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, private equity firms, and real estate investment trusts on the one hand, and asset management firms like mutual and index funds on the other, Cooper argues. The former group assails regulations and taxes, while the latter depends on them. The partisan split has typically been boiled down to Blackstone backing Republicans and BlackRock backing Democrats. Blackstone CEO Stephen Schwarzman has been one of the biggest individual donors to the GOP in recent years. The special relationship between BlackRock and Democrats has been more pronounced. Many plausibly describe the firm as a fourth branch of government when Democrats are in power, writes Cooper. A whole generation of advisors in both the Obama and Biden White Houses either came from BlackRock or went to the firm after their stints in government, as the Prospect has covered. There are occasional exceptions. Before he tapped Kevin Warsh to be chair of the Federal Reserve, President Trump was contemplating giving the job to Rick Rieder, one of BlackRock's chief investment officers, even as right-wing groups and lawmakers have derided the asset manager as woke for the last 5 years. Meanwhile, Jonathan Gray, Blackstone's president, bundled a few $100,000 for Kamala Harris's 2024 presidential campaign. But partisanship has not stopped a growing porosity of boundaries between these two factions of financial capital, Cooper told the Prospect. They may often vote differently, staff different administrations, and have different policy priorities, but they remain tied at the hip on the ledger. BlackRock formed when it split with Blackstone, and still holds a massive stake in the private equity firm, as do state pension funds. The SpaceX IPO has made the contradictions lurking amid these blurry boundaries all the more apparent, as public sector workers are poised to subsidize the architect of the most aggressive campaign against the civil service in recent memory, maybe ever, with little say in the matter. Someone like Musk and the big tech founders, it seems to me what they're doing is creating these massive infrastructural monopolies, whether it's over AI data centers, satellites, things that should be kind of natural government monopolies, says Cooper. And they've done it in a way where, although you have this mass of institutionally invested money leveraging these infrastructural monopolies, the distribution of profits is completely asymmetric, so that you have these founders or small groups of general partners, who are laying claim to the vast amount of capital gains. Citing that asymmetry of risk and reward, state pension fund leaders in Oregon, California, and New York have rallied against the NASDAQ rule changes that helped greenlight the IPO, to no avail. Most efforts to get large pension funds to divest from alternative equity investments like private equity or hedge funds have failed. But Cooper says the moment may be ripe for rethinking the relationship writ large. Instead of investing or detouring this money through the private markets, maybe public pensions should be performing their own investments, but also performing investments in public goods that have no appreciable asset value, that is simply there to be consumed, as, say, free public housing or free healthcare, she told the Prospect. There are signs of change. Earlier this year, New York City's pension fund announced it would begin a program along those lines, setting aside $4 billion for targeted investments in affordable housing over the next 4 years.
What lingers is the shift from the stage to the vault. In 1876, the telephone needed a Brazilian emperor's shout of surprise to prove it wasn't a toy. Today, tech firms don't seek that kind of public witness. They seek the quiet security of public pension funds. When innovation no longer has to survive the scrutiny of the market, the way an invention answers to the public changes. If the public is now a silent financier of tech power rather than its judge, what happens to the power to say no to where that technology leads?